Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this presentation, which is going to look at factors which influence website performance, both on the client side of the divide and on the server side. So, first of all, we have a look at the learning outcomes for today, which we're going to look at describing different file types which are used on the World Wide Web. We're going to look at describing user-side website performance factors and then server-side performance factors. So I think first of all, it's worth doing some background digging here, because the terms user and server-side are two quite separate things, and ultimately we need to actually work out what they are before we can move on past this. So I'll start right at the very beginning, which is where we just define what the World Wide Web and the Internet are. So obviously the World Wide Web and the Internet are used very interchangeably. So we could talk about our Internet being slow, or we could talk about our web being fast, or whatever it might be. And I mean, ultimately, the World Wide Web is a subset of the Internet. So the Internet is a massive network of networks that could be things which are much bigger than the World Wide Web. So it could be a network of databases that are linked together, or it could be a telephone system, whatever it might be. Whereas the World Wide Web is specially formatted web pages based around languages such as, but not limited to, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML is the language that the structure of all web pages is in HTML. You've got CSS to make it look good, and then you've got JavaScript to make it do something. Now, those three languages are discussed in other videos in more depth. That's not the purpose of this video. We also need to think about how the web works, so we actually can think about who the client is and where the server is. So the client is the person that is viewing the website. It's not the place where the website is stored. So if you've made a website, you know that it actually contains a physical files, and that's not what we're looking at in this example. We're looking at the place where the user views the website from. Now I've got a computer picture here. It doesn't necessarily need to be a computer. It could be a mobile phone, it could be a tablet, whatever. But ultimately, the scripts are executed on the client machine. So it's generally some lighter level stuff, such as it could be a rollover effect, for example, or it could be a little bit of validation, which, if you're not familiar with that term, or verification, if you're not familiar with those terms, basically checks data to make sure that it fits certain protocols. So rules, for example. So if you're taking a credit card number in, you could have a bit of a check to make sure that all the numbers that are in the credit card number are numbers and no letters, and so on. So you've also got the server, which is where the website is stored. Now, you could obviously have servers which look like this. However, you could also have, technically any computer in the world can become a server. You could make your own computer become a web server and make your website be accessible to anybody in the world. But there are a number of reasons why you wouldn't do that. I mean, complexity is one of them. Security is another one of them. Also, your computer has to be on all the time and available all the time for your website to be available. So generally, if it's a smaller website, you would probably pay somebody to host it for you. Hosting is not a particularly expensive issue unless you really want to go out on the limb and spend loads and loads and loads on it. That would be if you're expecting a lot of traffic. So the clients would search for a website, whatever that would be. So the URL, it would be www.google.com or bbc.co.uk or whatever it might be. And Internet Magic, which would be covered within a networking unit, through routers and so on, would send the request to wherever the website is stored. It would perform any actions that need to take place on there, such as a search within the database, and then this is returned to the client, and all this happens generally very quickly. So there are a number of factors which influence performance, both on the user side and the server side. Sometimes these can be the same issue, but affect performance differently on both ends. So, for example, bandwidth. will be an issue everywhere. But I want to discuss that later on when we actually come to it. But this was an activity for my class. Whether or not this is still available when you come to view this video largely depends on how many Padlets I've done in the meantime. It may or may not be available to you, so I guess you could try it if you really wanted to. But I wouldn't bank on it really, because you only get a certain amount of 3 Padlets. Although I do quite like them. If you're a teacher, they're quite a nice resource. So let's start off with some client-side factors. So I just mentioned bandwidth. So if your bandwidth is slow on your computer, then every single website you visit will be slow. It will be slow to load, it will be slow to react, and so on. I guess that if this was an issue for you, then you might be more forgiving if websites you visit are slow, because you might not be able to tell the difference. But ultimately that will be down to you, and you need to kind of expect as a developer that people won't have slow bandwidth. So you need to design your website well. Security is obviously going to be an issue, so people are likely to have or should have good levels of security on their machine. Now, the impact of that is that it's your security, whatever it might be, could well be checking all of the data going in and out of your machine along your internet access point, whatever it might be. And obviously that is going to slow it down, because it's going to need to be checked, and therefore it's not going to be quite as responsive as otherwise. Web browser is it is a big one. I would say web browsers, as we go forward, are becoming more reliable in terms of every browser tends to behave in a relatively similar way these days, whereas in the past you might have had issues, particularly with Internet Explorer, had a very poor reputation at one time. And they used to have, as a developer, you used to have to include all kinds of different hacks within your code to try and work around it. But these days, Edge is reasonable. I mean, I think for a little while yet, Microsoft browsers are going to carry the weight of previous iterations of their browser, but Edge is actually pretty decent. Most popular is going to be Chrome. Firefox will be up there, and obviously if you use a Mac, you'll be using something like Safari most likely. And the browsers all behave in a slightly different way. Plugins. So if you have different plugins installed on your browser or not, that could have an impact. So you might need Flash, for example, or you may need Shockwave or Silverlight or whatever it might be. That could have an impact on the way the website executes on the client machine. If your website needs a plugin and the client hasn't got a plugin, becoming reliant on that plugin is not a particularly good thing to do. Computer hardware, computer software. So ultimately, the quality of your computer is going to have a say on how a website runs. So if your computer is a very low spec machine, then you could have the best software in the world. In fact, you probably wouldn't want the best software in the world if your computer is low spec, because it would crawl or be extremely slow. If your computer is low spec, it's going to respond slower because it's going to find it harder to do the things that it needs to do. And obviously the software installed in it, a browser is a piece of software, security is a piece of software, so that is obviously going to have quite a big impact on it. It could also impact it in terms of if the amount of software that you have installed in your machine. If you're running lots of different things at once, it's going to use up a lot of RAM and a lot of memory. So it is something that you do need to be kind of thinking about. Server-side factors. So this is factors which influence the performance of the website from the server end. So as a client, you haven't got a lot of influence here. Bandwidth is obviously going to be an issue, but in a different way to the client. So if the server's bandwidth is poor, it will impact everybody who visits that website. Okay. However, if you're the client, it will only impact that one website. If your bandwidth as a client is good, but the bandwidth on the server side is bad, then that website will still run slow, and as a user will go elsewhere. And we've all kind of experienced this at one point or another. And we tended to avoid some websites because of that. Capacity, we're talking about how many people can visit the website once. You think of it as a road. If the road has too much traffic on it, it will crawl to a halt. And sometimes it will crash. Sometimes it will just run extremely slowly. And, these are obviously things to try and avoid. Security, is going to be more security on the server side than there will be on the client side. So, you need to have a think about the impact that will have. If you're storing a lot of customer data, then you're going to need to be subject to a lot of legislation like GDPR and so on, and it will potentially slow down the machine. It could potentially mean that it may require more expertise in order to set it up, because you need a lot more checks and a lot more security methods installed. The exact phrasing has actually escaped my mind somewhat at this point. And obviously we're looking at hardware and software for the same reasons which we outlined on the client side. Now, these two slides are not exhaustive things. You're welcome to come up with other examples of these if you so wish. And when you are talking about these in any submission, I would highly recommend that whereas I've got computer hardware, computer software, or PC hardware, PC software, the same thing, that you actually specify the hardware and the software. So don't just say computer, say specific things within the computer that will influence it. So for example, RAM, for example, your CPU is going to influence it. However, things like your monitor is not going to influence it from the server side, is it? The quality of the monitor they have there is not going to influence how you see the website. A few other things we need to discuss, which are more kind of rudimentary things. So we're looking at file types, and we're looking at image, video, and sound primarily. So for images, you've got two different main types for image, so vector and bitmap. So vector images are made up of mathematical equations, vectors, and so on. They're quite complex and commonly used for things like cartoons and logos, or advertisements of some kind, because you can resize them very easily. And they can be resized without loss of quality. However, you don't actually want highly detailed vector images, because those because of the equations involved, their file sizes can magnify very quickly. Vector graphics not supported in older browsers, particularly Internet Explorer. They are supported in some newer browsers, but the thing is, you always have to kind of weigh up the number of people that have older browsers still, and is that a risk you really want to take? Bitmap files, it's a big map of bits, so you can see here a load of squares. So in theory, each one of these squares is a bit that holds a value of color, and it, like I said, is suitable for very highly quality detailed graphics, such as a photo or a portrait or such like. And why I haven't quite used the right word here. It can be resized, but it can't be resized without you losing some kind of quality, which isn't necessarily what you're looking for. You ideally want to maintain the highest quality, so it looks nicer for the end user. Bitmap files are by far the most common that you will find on the web. You got bitmap file types. I'm not really talking about vector file types here because they're not really used that commonly. And for the task, I would rather concentrate on ones which you will find. So the uncompressed bitmap file is a .bmp, which is high quality, it's uncompressed, and that is the image file at its best. And so you might use that if you have something which needs to maintain everything within it. Now, of course, the issue here is that you're talking about a very big file size. So what you might want to do is rather than just put the image into the page itself, you could put a thumbnail there, and then say, because of the quality of the or size of the image, if you want to view it in its highest quality, you can always click on the thumbnail, and then it will take you to that. And then the end user is aware of the situation. JPEG is the Joint Photographic Expert Group is the most common one that you'll find on the internet or the web, even, which has very high compression. I've got good compression there. It's better than good. It's very good, and it's used for, it's basically, this thing has kind of been designed for the web, but of course, because it has compression, you're going to lose some of the quality there. It's not going to look quite as good as what a .bmp will be, but the actual file size is going to be much smaller, which means that the page is going to load quicker. So that could be a good thing. And I think also the smaller the screen, the less impact the really high quality graphics is going to have, because you can't see it as well anyway. You got .png, so portable network graphics, so the ability to use transparency, which can be good. So that means that you can potentially have different color backgrounds behind it and change the color of the background very easily, which can be quite nice. Now, why this obviously has an impact is the higher size of the graphic, longer it's going to take for it to appear, but also the less quality of the graphic means that it's going to look worse. Both of these things are generally things you want to avoid. I mean, you need to find some kind of medium there where you're happy enough with the quality of the image, but also it's not too big. Audio files, so you don't actually find audio files that frequently on the web, but there are some examples here, such as an MP3 file, which was very common a few years back, where the audio compressed, or the compressed audio even made it very easy to try and acquire MP3s, because they weren't very big. When you had worse download speeds, it meant that you didn't have to wait all night to get a song, or to download or to listen to a song. A WAV, a wave format, is much higher quality, sometimes 10 times big in terms of file size. Now that's if you're looking to just stream a song, then that's going to take you a lot longer to stream it than it would in an MP3 file. However, if you're a broadcaster and you're looking for really high quality sound, then that's probably where you want to go, because you want the best quality sound. You don't want music sounding tinny or anything like that. That's not what you're looking for at all. It can do nice things like setting mood. You might have a bit of music in the background, but you do need to be wary against not being able to give the user controls. So, if they can't turn it off, it's not what you're looking for. Video is the last thing. So video is obviously a mix of audio and visual. Of course, this is a video that you are watching right now, and the reason I'm doing it is because it gives you the maximum amount of information. It's also by far the largest file size, so I would anticipate, based on my experience of recording these videos in the past, that this video I'm currently recording right now will be somewhere in the region of 500 megabyte. That means that when I go to upload it to YouTube later in the evening, it's probably going to take about 15 minutes to upload it to YouTube, which doesn't bother me particularly, but those guys that have smaller bandwidth may have issues with that. Now, obviously, I'm not actually referring this task to to uploading YouTube videos. What I'm referring to is I was going off topic there a little bit, to be honest, is if you have a video on your web page, the impact of it will be that because it is so big, you either force the user to download it before it plays, and if it's a big video, what are they going to be doing in the meantime? Because it may take a few minutes for that to happen. Just going back to that thing, but ultimately once the video is downloaded, you then haven't got any buffering as it plays, which is a nice thing. But is that the critical thing? Or the video can be streamed, so in other words, it plays as it becomes available. So this is what you see if you go and watch a YouTube video. It will play as you are watching it, or download as you are watching it. It's a much more common thing because people haven't got to sit around, and these days with the download speeds available, it generally is fine. It generally plays straight through. Examples of video formats. So .mp4 is probably the most popular one at the minute. So it's a multimedia player that combines audio and video, which is so like I said, it's very popular at the minute. You've got a WMV, which is Windows Media File. So obviously this is created by Microsoft, and while it works reasonably well on Microsoft machines, it's not it's not massively suitable outside of Microsoft machines, which is not what you want. And I mean, it's good enough. It's not really compressed in any way. So you can get quite a high quality, but MP4s tend to be the video of choice. There is another example here where you have a .avi, excuse me, I croaked a little bit then, which is a very compressed audio video file, which is very, very small. Or I say it's very small. It's smaller than the other two, and in terms of quality, it's obviously going to be less. However, the smaller file size can be quite useful at times. .avi is certainly not as popular as what it was at about 15 years ago. But it's still used. You'll find all of these still in use around the web. And you've always got to think that, with any of these file types, they tend to have very similar patterns, in terms of larger the file size, the longer it's going to potentially take to download, which is something you generally want to avoid. You think about things like plugins. Does the end user have to download something to their web browser in order to play or do whatever you're asking from them? And if the answer is yes, then that's generally not a good thing to be doing. You don't want to rely on the end user to have to download software. I mean, if you think if it was flipped and you were put in that position, would you be prepared to download a plugin just to view a website, especially if it's on a popular topic? If it's a website on football, you certainly, or I say we certainly, it's unlikely people would be relatively happy to do that. Okay, well, I've come to the end of this presentation. I hope it has been useful to you. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.